Hi everyone, my name is Mark Moikins from Big Mountain Studio, and today I'm going to teach you about radial gradients. Now I know I made a video before about regular gradients, and radial gradients compared to the regular gradients is a lot more complicated for some reason, as you're going to see in this video. So what I did is I did a lot of research and I tried to make it as simple as possible to teach you guys how to do this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically create radial gradients in such a way that you can reuse and apply to any UI view through the use of interface builder, inspectables, and designables. So what that means is you can put a UI view on your storyboard, you can set a couple of colors, and it will create your gradient for you right on your UI view. Alright, so let's get started. First, what I'm going to do is create a new file that will hold this functionality. And I'm going to use the Cocoa Touch class, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to add functionality onto the UI view. Remember, we just want to drag a UI view onto our storyboard and set two colors. So what I have to do is I have to subclass a UI view, which means I'm going to take an existing object, such as the UI view, and add more functionality on top of it. And here, we'll just call it a radial gradient view. Oh, I spelled that wrong, didn't I? Radial gradient view. There we go. Okay, so here's my class, and it's subclassing UI view, so that means I'm basically going to be adding more functionality on top of the UI view. Now, in order to be able to see the changes that I make on the storyboard, I need to give this a class attribute called IBDesignable. And that basically just means that we can work with this UI view inside of the interface builder or on a storyboard. Okay, so we know we need two things at least. For a minimum, we need two colors. The inner color inside the circle and an outer color that the gradient will be transitioning to. And basically that's what a gradient means, is it transitions from one color gradually to another color. So in order to edit these colors, we have to mark them as IB inspectable. And that means this color will show up, or this property will show up in the attributes inspector at design time. So we want an inside color, which will be a type of UI color. And we should give it a default, so not all the times will we want a first or a second color, or an inside and an outside color. So I'll just default it to UI color clear. Then we want another property for the outside color. So I'm just going to copy this and paste it in there, and I'm going to call it outside color. Okay, so these colors by themselves aren't going to do anything. If we come over here and I click on this view right here, and say I change this to our new radial gradient view, wait for it to compile. All right, it's up to date. Now if I come here, you can see I can choose two colors, but when I choose colors, nothing happens. So let's fix that. Now what we want to do is we're going to override one of the functions of the UI view, which is the draw function. This one right here. Okay, the draw function is basically responsible for drawing the contents on the UI view. So we want to draw a gradient on the UI view, so we're going to use this function. Now there's going to be some complicated terms that we're going to run into, and I'm going to describe them on the way as we build this out. So the first thing we'll work on is creating our gradient. Gradient equals core graphics gradient. Okay, so this is the initializer that we're going to use. It's a simpler of the two, but it'll still work perfectly for our purposes. Now for color space, we're not going to really worry about that. See that question mark? That basically means it's optional, so we can pass in nil if we want. But just to let you know, color space is a way to help the device figure out how to take your color and translate it to the available colors on the device. Different devices have different amounts of colors, or can have different amounts of colors. So it helps take the color that you have, which you're going to pass in here, and translate it so it looks best on that device. But we're just going to pass in nil because we don't really need to set a color space. And for the colors array, we're going to create that. I'll just call it colors for now. That'll be the name of our variable. And for locations, I'm going to pass in nil for this too. Now locations, what that means is you can optionally specify where the first color starts, the inner color. You can specify where that starts, and you can specify where the outer color starts. And if you have more than one color, you can say, well, one color, it's a value between 0 and 1. So one color might start at 0 in the very center. One color starts at 50% or 0.5, so it's in the middle. And one color starts at 1, which is the last point. But if you pass in nil, it's just going to apply the first color to 0 and the last color at 1, which is 100% at the end of the circle. So we need a colors variable to pass in here. So let's create that. And we called it colors equals, and I'm just going to initialize an array here. And the first one will be my inside color. And for this variable right here, it needs the core graphics color. So we can just use this property right here and get the core graphics color version of the UI color. And then we need our outside color. And we need the core graphics color version of the UI color. And it's not going to work now because it's a different type. Like I'll show you here. See, it's looking for a CF array, which is a core foundation array, which is just a different type of array. So let's convert this to a core foundation array. Okay, and that works. So that helps us set up our gradient. Now, the next thing you have to do is you have to take this gradient information, this object here, and then you have to pass it into another function which is actually going to draw our gradient. But before we can do that, we need to get the context, the graphics context of our UI view. Context, what does that mean? What's a graphics context? Well, a context, you might already know what that means. It's basically like all the pieces of something in an area that forms an idea or a sentence or a concept. So in this case, the context that we're looking for is the graphics context, which is basically inside of this CGRect. And a graphics context, well, let me see if I can describe it here. A graphics context conceptually is an object that describes a few things. It describes the drawing area, where and how the drawing should occur, the colors to use when drawing, the line width and style information, font information, and all the device-specific information needed to render graphics, and so on. Oh man, how do we supply all that? Well, we don't really have to. The UI view actually already has all of its own graphics context. So what we need to do is we just need to get the current context that already exists. And the way you do that is you just say UI graphics get current context right there. And that can return a nil, but when we use it inside of the draw, we know we're definitely going to have a graphics context, so we can just put an exclamation point behind there because we know we're going to have one. And then from here, you can see there's a lot of drawing operations. And these drawing operations all need information that might be inside of this view, such as, like I said before, the colors that are going to be used, the line styles, and fonts. The one we're interested in is draw radial gradient. And as you can see, paints a gradient fill that varies along the area defined by the provided starting and ending circles. I want to explain something about the radial gradients and how they work. You're actually defining two circles, and you're telling the gradient to move from one circle, which is like maybe your inner circle, to an outer circle. And most of the times you see gradients where the small circle is centered on the bigger circle. But you can actually have those two circles be anywhere on the screen away from each other. They don't have to be centered within each other, or what's called concentric circles. They can be anywhere. But for simplicity, we're going to keep both those circles concentric. We're going to keep them exactly aligned inside each other. And the beginning circle is basically just going to be a dot. It's not even going to be a circle. It's just going to be a dot that we start from. So our gradient is this variable that we created up above. And the start center, if I just use center is the property of the frame. Right here we pass in a CGRect. frame, and this is basically the center of the UI view. And the start radius is basically, well, first of all, what is a radius? A radius is the straight line from the center of the circle to the outer edge of the circle. That's a radius. So the start radius is, it's asking like, how big is our circle going to be? Well, the radius is going to be 0. It's actually, that's why I said it's just going to be a dot. It's not even going to be a circle. It's just going to be a dot. So there's no radius. The circle is just a dot. The end circle will also start from the center. And how big will that be? Well, what we want is we want the end radius to be as big as our frame, as big as our UI view. So this is going to be a little bit tricky. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a variable called end radius. Now when I do this, the variable doesn't exist yet, so I'm going to create it. Let end radius equals, and I'm putting it into a variable because there's some calculations that go along with it. So think about this. What we want is our UI view might not be square. If I come here, as you can see, this UI view is not square. I can make it square. Let me just give it a different color so we can see it better. So what we want is we want basically the outer circle to fill the most narrow part of the UI view. So if it's like this, we want it to, it might not extend all the way to this edge. We want it perfectly circular and it'll come out like this. Or vice versa, if the UI view is only like this, we still want it to be to fill up only the most narrow part of the UI view in the center. And so the radius will always be from the very center to the edge of the most narrow part of the UI view. So from here, the radius will be from where my cursor is now to the outside part. And if our UI view is like this, it'll be from the center where my cursor is to the edge of the most narrow part. So how do we do that? Well, first of all, what we need to do is find what the most narrow part is. And it's easier than you think. There's a function called min, which all it does is returns the smallest of two values. And that's what we're going to do. So we're going to pass in the frame width and the frame height. And we're going to tell it, give me the smallest one. So once it has the smallest value, we're just going to divide it in 2. Because remember, we want to start from the center and go out to the edge. So if we divide it by 2, we'll take exactly half of that. And that's going to be our end radius, which is right here. And remember, the end radius is the outer circle. Okay, options. We're almost done. For options, you have 2 options. Draw after end location and draw as before start location. Now what this means is when we draw our circle, actually, you know what? Why don't I just show you instead of describe it to you? Let's select this option first. Oh, let's see, what's it need here? There we go. Okay, now let's take a look. Okay, good. So we already set this view to use our radial gradient view. And so we have an inside color, and let's set an outside color, maybe like black or something. All right, now take a look at this. In our example, we're starting from a dot. So this first option that we're using, draws before start location, that would be handy if we didn't start with a dot. If this beginning start radius was something like, let me just show you an example here. If we start with 10 and we go back in there, let's let it compile. Okay, I don't know if you can see this, but there's actually a small circle inside where it's a solid color. So it's kind of pushing out that inner color, or the inside color. It's pushing it out further because we made it 10. So the radius is 10 points, which means the circle from one edge to the next edge from side to side is 20. And what's happening is, because we set that option, it's going to fill in the inside color with the inside. it's going to fill in the inside of the circle with the inside color. Now let's look at the other option. Okay, draws after end location. I think you might be able to guess what's going to happen here. Wait for it to compile. There we go. So now the end color that we have, black, after it fills in that outer circle, it keeps going beyond it and goes out to the edges until it hits the edge of the UI view. And now we can also see our inner circle too. And this is what we don't want. So, or you might want it depending on your needs. But for this purpose, we don't really want that because it doesn't really look good, does it? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back and I'm just going to change that back to 0.0. Okay, so there's your radial gradient. Now in this case, it's on your main view right here. So you don't really have a choice of like where to position it or anything like that. Another option that you could do is you just take this off. Okay, so we're just going to put a UI view on here. And for this, we'll just change the class to Radial Gradient View. Wait for it to update. And then let's apply some colors. Maybe for the inside color, we'll do this orange. Oh, I want to show you something about this. Notice we only see the tip of the gradient here, right? The beginning. And then for the outside color, let's make a darker color. Maybe like this. What is happening here? Those two colors are too close together. Let's make this darker. There we go. You couldn't see it. Now remember, in our code, we wanted the center to be always the center of the UI view. So why is it down here? Well, I believe that this is because of a deficiency in my own knowledge on what center actually means. To me, center, I thought, would be the center of the frame. Yeah, right here. Center is the center of the frame. But I think, from what I've read, I think I have a misconception on that because of where we're using it in the draw. In the draw, I've read some places where someone says the frame has to be defined first before the center will actually give you the center of the frame. And I think that's because the frame at this point where this code is not quite defined yet. So we'll have to specify the center ourselves. So let's make another variable for center. And the center is pretty easy to calculate, right? Because all we really need is the width divided by 2 and the height divided by 2, and that's our center. And the center for this case is we need a core graphics point. So we'll just say new core graphics point. And of course, we're going to be specifying the X and the Y, which will be the center, and we'll use double. I think that'll work for our needs. And then we're going to take the bounds, or we could also just take the frame too. Now we'll take the bounds because the frame might not be set yet. And we'll get the size and then the width and divide that by 2. And then for the Y, that pertains to the height. So let's go bounds dot size dot height and divide that by 2. All right, and that should give us our center. And I've already used the word center, so it'll just use this variable now instead. Let's go back in and see if that fixed it. It's compiling. Yeah, there you go. So that's much better. Now we're talking about positioning because when you're using the regular view, you might not always want a radial gradient positioned like this. You might want it off-centered, so maybe you drag the view bigger so it's brighter in this spot and it gets a little bit darker in these corners. And then you can just move it any way you want for your own purposes. Maybe you want it down at the bottom so it's kind of like a sunrise effect. Whatever you need. You can just move it around and then set some constraints so it stays in that general position. Now, one of the things that you could do as well, if you don't want to move the UI view around like this, you could actually create another property, which is a CG point, so you can set the X and Y, and you could use that here instead. Now remember, we're always using the center for the CG point for the center, but you could take this and create an IB inspectable for it and use that instead. All right, so that's all I have for gradients. Thank you for watching. If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing. Thank you.